At 3:07 a.m., with a mug of lukewarm coffee in hand, James stood on his porch, watching the chaos unfold below. The once pristine suburban enclave, governed by the iron fist of the Homeowners Association, HOA, had transformed into what could only be described as a post-apocalyptic water park. Karen, the HOA president and self-proclaimed ruler of all things aesthetically pleasing, was knee-deep in muddy water, her designer yoga pants soaked through as she screamed into her phone. Somewhere downstream, her Lexus floated serenely past like a luxury cruise liner that had lost its way. James took a sip of his coffee and smirked. "Well," he muttered to himself, "this is what happens when you mess with an orchard man. To truly appreciate the poetic justice of this moment, we need to rewind a few months, to the beginning of James's war with the HOA. James was not your typical suburbanite. He didn't care for manicured lawns or cookie-cutter houses painted in shades of beige approved by Karen's Architectural Review Committee. No, James was a man of the earth, a proud steward of his family's orchard that bordered the HOA's territory. His land was his sanctuary, filled with apple trees that whispered secrets to the wind and pear trees that bore fruit sweeter than revenge itself. But Karen saw James's orchard as an affront to everything she stood for. To her, it was a chaotic blot on an otherwise perfect neighborhood canvas, a wild tangle of nature that dared to resist her HOA-approved vision of suburban utopia. And so began her campaign to bring James to heel. The first shot fired in this battle came in the form of a letter, delivered by certified mail, no less. It was written in Karen's signature passive-aggressive tone. "Dear Mr. James, it has come to our attention that your property's irrigation system may be contributing to excess water runoff into HOA territory. This is a violation of Section 14.3b of the Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, CC and RS. Please address this matter immediately to avoid further action." James read the letter twice, then crumpled it into a ball and tossed it into his compost bin. Karen wasn't done. A week later, she escalated her tactics. Without warning or permission, HOA contractors arrived at James's property line and began digging a trench, a monstrous scar across his land designed to divert water away from HOA territory. The trench cut through his orchard like an open wound, severing roots and killing several trees in its wake. When James confronted Karen about this blatant act of vandalism, she responded with her trademark condescension. "It's for the good of the community, James. Surely you understand." Understand? Oh, James understood all right. He understood that Karen and her HOA cronies were drunk on power, the kind of power that comes from enforcing arbitrary rules about fence heights and mailbox colors. He also understood that he couldn't fight them through conventional means. Legal action would be costly and time-consuming, and Karen knew how to weaponize bureaucracy better than anyone. So James did what any self-respecting orchard man would do when pushed to his limit. He got creative. The plan began as a seed, an idea planted during one particularly sleepless night as James stared at the trench that had ruined his orchard. If Karen wanted water diverted away from HOA territory, he thought, why not give her exactly what she asked for? But instead of diverting water away from the HOA, he would redirect it toward them, straight into their meticulously landscaped lawns and perfectly paved driveways. James enlisted the help of his old college buddy Eli, a civil engineer with a penchant for mischief. Together, they designed a covert drainage system that would reroute rainwater from his property directly into HOA territory during heavy storms. It was an ingenious setup, hidden beneath layers of soil and camouflaged by newly planted trees, and it took weeks to complete under the cover of darkness. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Just as they finished installing the system, weather forecasts predicted one of the biggest storms in recent memory, a deluge that would test their handiwork to its limits. When the storm hit, it was biblical in its intensity. Rain poured down in sheets, turning streets into rivers and lawns into swamps. And as predicted, James's drainage system roared to life like some vengeful hydrological beast unleashed upon suburbia. By dawn, HOA territory was unrecognizable. Water pooled in driveways and seeped into basements. Flower beds floated away like tiny rafts carrying doomed petunias. Even Karen's prized gazebo, A structure she had once described as the heart and soul of our community was reduced to driftwood. Karen herself was apoplectic. She stormed through the floodwaters like an enraged sea goddess, barking orders at hapless neighbors while trying to salvage what little remained of her domain. "This is sabotage," she screamed at anyone who would listen. "We're under attack." James watched all this unfold from his porch with quiet satisfaction. He didn't need recognition or applause. Watching Karen flail helplessly in muddy water was reward enough. As he finished his coffee and turned to go inside, he caught sight of something truly poetic. One of his fallen apple trees, uprooted by Karen's trench months ago, had washed up on her front lawn like an accusatory ghost from battles past. James chuckled softly and muttered under his breath, "Nature always finds a way." James's war with the HOA didn't start with a bang. No, it began with a drizzle. A light, unassuming rain that fell one spring morning and set the stage for what would become an epic clash of wills. It was the kind of rain that made James's orchard come alive, the kind that turned the soil rich and dark and made the blossoms on his apple trees glisten like tiny jewels. To James, it was a gift from nature. To Karen, however, it was a harbinger of doom. Karen had always been obsessed with water. Not in a poetic, life-giving force of nature kind of way, but in a paranoid, "it's going to destroy my property value" kind of way. She saw every drop of rain as a personal affront, every puddle as a threat to her perfectly curated suburban paradise. So when that spring rain turned into a heavier downpour and a small stream of water trickled across the border from James's property into HOA territory, Karen sprang into action like a mall cop chasing down a teenager on a skateboard. The first thing she did was call an emergency meeting of the HOA board. Now, if you've never had the misfortune of attending an HOA meeting, let me paint you a picture. It's like jury duty, but somehow worse. Imagine a room full of people who take themselves way too seriously, arguing over things like whether beige or taupe is the superior house color. That's an HOA meeting. And Karen? She was the queen bee of this hive of mediocrity. At this particular meeting, Karen presented her case against James with all the fervor of a prosecutor in a high-stakes murder trial. She brought photos, grainy close-ups of muddy water pooling near her hydrangeas, and waved them around like they were smoking guns. "This," she declared dramatically, "is what happens when we allow unchecked water flow from non-HOA properties. It's an assault on our community standards." The other board members nodded solemnly, as if Karen had just uncovered some vast conspiracy involving big water. They voted unanimously to take action against James. The next day, James received another letter from the HOA, this one even more pompous than the last. It accused him of negligent water management and demanded that he submit a plan to prevent further runoff into HOA territory. James read it while sitting under one of his apple trees, munching on an apple so crisp it practically crunched in defiance. "Negligent water management," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. "What am I supposed to do? Tell the rain to stay on my side of the fence?" But Karen wasn't interested in logic or reason. She wanted results, or at least something she could point to during her next HOA meeting as proof that she was keeping the neighborhood safe from rogue water molecules. That's when she decided to take matters into her own hands, or rather, into the hands of whatever cheap contractor she could find who was willing to dig up someone else's property without asking questions. James came home one afternoon to find them there. Two guys in neon vests operating heavy machinery right on his property line. They were digging what could only be described as a trench, a deep, ugly scar in the earth that cut through his orchard like a knife through butter. "What the hell is this?" James demanded as he marched over. One of the workers shrugged and pointed toward HOA territory. "They said it was for drainage." James looked at the trench in disbelief. It ran straight through his orchard, slicing through tree roots and leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Several trees were already leaning precariously. Others looked like they wouldn't survive much longer. He stormed over to Karen's house, because where else would she be but at home micromanaging her perfectly symmetrical flower beds? She answered the door with her usual air of smug superiority. "Karen," James said through gritted teeth, "what is going on with this trench?" "Oh," she replied with feigned innocence. You mean the drainage improvement project? It's for the good of the community. The good of the community? James repeated incredulously. You've destroyed half my orchard. Karen waved her hand dismissively. Oh, please, James. Those trees were practically dead anyway. They were not dead, he shouted. They were thriving until your guys came along with their backhoes. Karen crossed her arms and gave him that condescending smile she reserved for people who dared to question her authority. Look, she said, if you have an issue with this, you can file a formal complaint with the HOA board. James stared at her for a long moment, silently weighing his options. He could file a complaint, sure, but he knew exactly how that would go. The board would side with Karen because they always sided with Karen. She'd probably even turn it into some kind of victory lap at the next meeting. Oh, look at me! I solved another problem for our community. No, filing a complaint wasn't going to cut it. Instead, he did what any rational person would do when faced with an unreasonable adversary. He went home and started plotting his revenge. But before we get to that part, and trust me, it's worth waiting for, let's take a moment to appreciate just how absurd this whole situation had become. Here was Karen, a woman who once tried to fine someone for having Christmas lights up past January 15th, acting like she was solving some kind of environmental crisis by digging up James's orchard. And here was James, a man who just wanted to grow apples in peace, being dragged into what could only be described as suburban warfare. It was ridiculous. It was petty. And yet, it was also kind of perfect. Because sometimes life isn't about grand gestures or noble causes. Sometimes it's about standing your ground against people who think they can bulldoze their way through your life, literally and figuratively, without consequences. And if there's one thing James knew for sure as he sat down under his remaining apple trees that evening, it was this. Karen had picked the wrong orchard man to mess with. James sat at his kitchen table that night, staring at the HOA letter Karen had sent him weeks ago, now crumpled and coffee-stained. Next to it was a stack of legal documents he'd printed out after a frantic Google search for, "Can HOA dig a trench on my property?" The answer, as it turned out, was a resounding maybe. The law, in all its infinite wisdom, was about as clear as Karen's reasoning for why beige was the only acceptable color for garage doors. He'd even called a lawyer, a guy named Brad who sounded like he spent more time golfing than practicing law. Brad had listened to James's story with mild interest before delivering the bad news. Technically, they're within their rights to manage water runoff if it's impacting their property. You could sue, but it'll cost you a fortune and take years. Plus, HOAs are like cockroaches. They're hard to kill. James hung up on Brad and poured himself a stiff drink. He wasn't going to spend the next 5 years of his life locked in a legal battle with Karen and her band of suburban stormtroopers. No, he needed another plan, something faster, cheaper, and infinitely more satisfying. That's when he remembered Eli. Eli was an old college buddy who had majored in civil engineering but had the soul of a prankster. He was the kind of guy who could design a structurally sound bridge one day and rig your dorm room door to dump a bucket of water on your head the next. If anyone could help James turn the tables on Karen, it was Eli. James called him up and explained the situation. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Eli finally said, "So let me get this straight. They dug a trench through your orchard without permission, killed your trees, and now they're blaming you for water runoff." "Pretty much," James replied. "And you want me to help you, what? Flood their neighborhood?" James hesitated for half a second before saying, "Yes." Eli let out a low whistle. "Man, I've missed you." The next weekend, Eli showed up at James's house with a truck full of equipment and an evil glint in his eye. Together, they walked the length of the trench Karen's contractors had dug, examining it like two generals surveying a battlefield. "This is amateur hour," Eli said, kicking at the dirt. "They didn't even compact the soil properly. No wonder your trees are dying." James crossed his arms and nodded solemnly. "So what do we do?" Eli grinned. "We fight fire with water." Over the next few weeks, James and Eli worked in secret, often under cover of darkness to avoid nosy neighbors or HOA spies. Because if anyone was petty enough to hire spies, it was Karen. They dug new trenches, smaller ones that branched off from Karen's monstrosity, and installed hidden pipes that would redirect rainwater from James's property back into HOA territory. But they didn't stop there. Oh no, Eli had come up with what he called the masterstroke, a series of strategically placed valves that would allow James to control the flow of water depending on how much rain fell. A light drizzle, a gentle trickle into HOA flower beds, a torrential downpour, a full-on biblical flood. By the time they were finished, James's orchard looked almost normal again, just with a few extra mounds of dirt here and there that no one would notice unless they were actively looking for them. The real magic lay underground, where Eli's network of pipes waited like a sleeping dragon. Then came the waiting game. For weeks, James kept an eye on the weather forecast like a farmer desperate for rain. Except in his case, he wasn't hoping for rain to nourish his crops. He was hoping for rain to drown his enemies, metaphorically speaking mostly. And then, finally, it happened. A massive storm system rolled in from the west, bringing with it promises of heavy rainfall and flash floods. James stood on his porch that evening as the first drops began to fall. He could feel it in his bones. This was going to be big. By midnight, the rain was coming down in sheets. James grabbed his flashlight and headed out into the orchard to check on Eli's handiwork. Sure enough, everything was working perfectly. Water flowed through the hidden pipes like clockwork, bypassing James's property entirely and heading straight for HOA territory. He couldn't resist taking a quick detour to see how things were looking on Karen's side of the fence. What he saw nearly made him laugh out loud. Karen's yard, her meticulously maintained oasis of hydrangeas and ornamental grasses, was quickly turning into a swamp. Water pooled around her gazebo, the one she'd once described as the crown jewel of our community, and spilled over onto her driveway. Her prized Lexus sat parked outside her garage, its tires already halfway submerged. James stayed just long enough to snap a few photos before retreating back to his porch. By morning, the storm had passed, but its aftermath was glorious. HOA territory looked like something out of an apocalyptic movie. Lawns were flooded. Flower beds were washed away. Even some of those ridiculous lawn gnomes people insisted on displaying had been swept down the street like tiny ceramic refugees. Karen herself was in full meltdown mode when James saw her later that day. She stood ankle-deep in muddy water outside her house, yelling into her phone while gesturing wildly at what remained of her yard. "This is sabotage!" She shrieked loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. "Someone did this on purpose." James sipped his coffee from his porch and smiled to himself. Sabotage? Maybe. Justice? Absolutely. For now, though, he played dumb. Just another innocent bystander watching nature take its course. "Well," he muttered under his breath as Karen stomped around in her ruined garden. "Looks like someone needs better drainage." The morning after the storm, James woke up to the sound of chaos. Not the usual suburban chaos of barking dogs or leaf blowers, but the kind that only comes when Mother Nature decides to remind everyone who's really in charge. He stepped onto his porch with a fresh cup of coffee and was greeted by the sight of his handiwork in full bloom. The HOA neighborhood looked like Atlantis, if Atlantis had been designed by people obsessed with beige siding and overpriced lawn ornaments. Cars were half submerged, their alarms blaring weakly as if they, too, had given up. Decorative mulch floated lazily down the street like tiny rafts carrying twigs and despair. And Karen, oh Karen, was standing in the middle of it all, her phone clutched in one hand and a soggy clipboard in the other, barking orders at anyone unfortunate enough to cross her path. James took a long sip of his coffee and smiled. It was a smile that said, "I didn't start this war, but I sure as hell finished it." Karen's voice carried across the floodwaters like an angry seagull. "This is unacceptable. Where is the drainage committee? We need pumps, sandbags, action." She waved her clipboard around as if it were a magic wand that could make the water disappear. Spoiler alert, it couldn't. James leaned against the porch railing and watched as Karen's Lexus bobbed gently in her driveway like a very expensive buoy. He couldn't help but admire the poetic justice of it all. This was a woman who had once fined a neighbor $50 for having non-regulation holiday lights. And now her own yard looked like a scene from Waterworld. Somewhere deep inside him, James felt a tiny pang of guilt. But then he remembered the trench, the dead trees, and Karen's smug face telling him it was for the good of the community. The guilt evaporated instantly. As James enjoyed his front row seat to suburban Armageddon, his phone buzzed. It was Eli. "Morning," Eli said cheerfully. "How's our little project holding up?" James chuckled. "Let's just say HOA territory is now officially waterfront property." Eli laughed so hard James thought he might choke. "Man, I wish I could see Karen's face right now." "Oh, you'd love it," James replied. "She's out there with a clipboard trying to organize a rescue mission for her hydrangeas." "Classic Karen," Eli said. "So what's next? You gonna confess? Take credit for your masterpiece?" James shook his head, even though Eli couldn't see him. "Nah, let her think it's an act of God. Besides, I'm not done enjoying this yet." And enjoy it he did. Over the next few hours, James watched as Karen's carefully constructed world crumbled around her. The HOA board members, most of whom had probably never dealt with anything more serious than a slightly overgrown hedge, were running around like headless chickens. Someone had brought out an inflatable kayak to ferry people across particularly deep sections of water, which only added to the absurdity of the scene. At one point, Karen tried to rally her neighbors into forming some kind of bucket brigade to bail out flooded basements. Predictably, this plan fell apart almost immediately when one man refused on the grounds that it wasn't listed in his HOA dues agreement. By midday, local news crews had arrived to cover what they were calling an unprecedented flooding event. A reporter stood knee-deep in water outside Karen's house, microphone in hand. "We're here in what used to be a quiet suburban neighborhood," she said solemnly, "where residents are dealing with severe flooding after last night's storm. Homeowners are demanding answers as they face extensive property damage." The camera panned to Karen, who looked like she was about 2 seconds away from having a full-blown meltdown. "This is outrageous," she declared to the reporter. "We have strict water management policies in place. This should not be happening." James nearly spit out his coffee at that one. Strict water management policies? Coming from the woman who had turned his orchard into a swamp just months ago? The irony was almost too much to handle. As Karen continued her tirade on live television, blaming everything from climate change to unregulated properties, a thinly veiled jab at James, he decided it was time for some light mischief. He grabbed his phone and pulled up Facebook. The HOA had its own group page, because of course it did, and James couldn't resist posting a little something for all to see. "Thoughts and prayers for our HOA leadership during this difficult time," he wrote, adding a winking emoji for good measure. The post blew up almost immediately. Comments ranged from supportive, "Stay strong," to sarcastic, "Maybe we should fine Mother Nature for non-compliance." One particularly bold neighbor even suggested starting a GoFundMe for Karen's gazebo repair fund. By late afternoon, city officials arrived with pumps and heavy equipment to start draining the neighborhood. Karen greeted them like they were reinforcements arriving on D-Day, but even they seemed unimpressed by her demands for immediate action. "This is going to take time," one city worker explained patiently as Karen hovered over him like an angry school principal. "You can't just pump all this water out in an hour." Karen huffed dramatically but had no choice but to back off. Meanwhile, James decided it was time for some damage control. Not for himself, he was having way too much fun, but for his orchard. With Eli's help, he inspected their drainage system to make sure everything was still functioning properly. To their relief and mild surprise, it was holding up beautifully. "Honestly," Eli said as they walked back toward James's house, "I think we missed our calling as evil geniuses." James laughed. "Speak for yourself. I'm just a humble orchard man defending my land." "Sure you are," Eli replied with a smirk, "and I'm just here for moral support." As evening fell and the floodwaters began to recede, thanks largely to the city workers who clearly deserved medals, James sat on his porch once again, watching his life slowly return to normal, or at least as normal as things could be after such an epic disaster. Karen was still out there, now armed with a megaphone and what appeared to be laminated maps of some kind. She was directing traffic, or at least trying to, but most people were ignoring her at this point. James raised his coffee mug in her direction in a silent toast. "To you, Karen," he said quietly. "May your clipboard never run out of paper." James woke up the next morning to a strange sound. It wasn't the usual chirping of birds or the distant hum of lawnmowers. It was silence. The kind of eerie, unnatural silence that only occurs when an entire neighborhood collectively agrees to avoid eye contact and pretend they're not living in a disaster zone. He stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand, and surveyed the aftermath. The floodwaters had mostly receded, leaving behind a landscape that could only be described as suburban carnage. Lawns were reduced to muddy wastelands, flower beds looked like they'd been attacked by feral raccoons, and Karen's gazebo, her precious crown jewel, was now leaning at a 45-degree angle, its once white paint streaked with mud. James couldn't help but admire the scene. It was like watching the closing credits of a disaster movie, except he was the director and Karen was the unwitting star. Speaking of Karen, she was nowhere to be seen. James figured she was probably holed up in her house, drafting angry emails or plotting her next HOA power move. But as the day wore on, it became clear that Karen's reign of terror might finally be coming to an end. The first sign was the arrival of a city inspector, a no-nonsense woman named Linda who looked like she'd seen it all and wasn't impressed by any of it. Linda spent hours walking through the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, jotting down notes and occasionally shaking her head in disbelief. When she reached James's property, she paused and gave him a long, appraising look. "Nice orchard," she said. "Thanks," James replied cautiously. Linda pointed toward the trench that HOA contractors had dug months ago. "That's illegal." James blinked. "Excuse me? That trench," Linda said matter-of-factly. "It violates multiple zoning regulations and drainage codes. Whoever dug it is in deep trouble." James felt a wave of vindication wash over him. "You don't say." Linda nodded and scribbled something on her clipboard. "I'll be filing a report with the city. Expect some follow-up." James watched her walk away with a newfound sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Karen was finally going to face some consequences for her actions. And oh, did those consequences come swiftly. By mid-afternoon, word had spread through the neighborhood that Karen was under investigation for unauthorized construction and improper water management practices. The HOA board held an emergency meeting, because of course they did. But this time, things didn't go Karen's way. James wasn't invited to the meeting, he never was. But he heard all about it from his neighbor Susan, who had a knack for gossip and zero loyalty to Karen. "They're turning on her," Susan whispered conspiratorially over the fence. "The board is blaming her for everything. The trench, the flooding, even the gazebo." James raised an eyebrow. "The gazebo?" Susan nodded solemnly. "Apparently she used HOA funds to build it without proper approval." James let out a low whistle. "That's bold." "It gets better," Susan continued. "They're talking about removing her as president." James couldn't hide his grin. Well, it's about time. By evening, it was official. Karen had been ousted as HOA president in what Susan described as a vote so unanimous it was almost cruel. She didn't even bother showing up to defend herself, probably because she knew it was hopeless. The next few days were blissfully quiet. Without Karen calling the shots, the HOA seemed to lose its appetite for micromanaging everyone's lives. People started leaving their trash cans out for an extra day without fear of fines. One brave soul even painted their mailbox blue, a color that had been strictly forbidden under Karen's regime. As for James, he finally got back to doing what he loved, tending to his orchard. With Eli's help and some extra funds from a small insurance payout, he replanted several trees and installed a new irrigation system that would keep everything thriving for years to come. The orchard felt alive again, a stark contrast to the lifeless lawns on HOA territory. One afternoon, as James was pruning his apple trees, he heard a voice call out from the street. "Hey, you're the guy who flooded the HOA, right?" James turned to see a kid on a bike, a freckled teenager with an oversized backpack and an expression of pure admiration. "I don't know what you're talking about," James said with mock innocence. The kid grinned. "Yeah, sure you don't. My dad says you're like Robin Hood but with water." James laughed despite himself. "Tell your dad I'm just an orchard man." The kid nodded sagely before pedaling off down the street. As James watched him disappear into the distance, he realized something. He hadn't just won his battle against Karen. He'd become something of a local legend. People were talking about him not as a victim but as a hero. A man who stood up to tyranny with nothing but ingenuity and a little help from Mother Nature. And honestly, he kind of liked it. So here's the moral of the story. Sometimes life throws you into situations where playing by the rules just doesn't cut it. Sometimes you have to fight fire with water, or in James's case, fight bureaucracy with floods. And when you do, make sure you enjoy every single moment of your victory. Now, if you enjoyed this tale of suburban warfare and poetic justice, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends who've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare, comment below with your own revenge stories, because I know you've got them, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss another epic saga like this one. Thanks for watching.